Conflict resolution is often seen as simply a negotiation around the facts of a matter. Say you're negotiating with a client over a contract and they're disagreeing with you on something. Surely, it's just a matter of better explaining the details of the situation to them, at which point they will understand your point and come on board. But as anyone who has ever had to deal with such a conflict before can tell you, it's very rarely this simple. There are so many layers in any given conflict that make simple delivery of the facts completely implausible as a resolution technique. And while most conflict resolution techniques focus on ways to speak to your opponent, or things to say, or active listening, or body language, this can be rather ephemeral and simplistic when dealing with conflicts inside the workplace. Conflict resolution is an essential component of professional ethics, because while you can use the various techniques discussed here and in other videos to determine for yourself what the best course of action is, none of that means a lot if you can't then influence other people's thinking about it and change their minds. So, if we are aiming to change the minds of others to promote a better course of action, then we need to understand why they disagree with us. Not that they do, or about what, but why. And to this end, I'm offering you the 5 reasons why people disagree with you. Looking at this from a really fundamental level as a matter of motivation, as opposed to the simple details of the disagreement. Starting with the very first one, because you're wrong. Now that sounds straightforward, but how often do you actually check? Think about the experience of being in a disagreement. Things are starting to get a little bit heated. You've got a difference of opinion. You're starting to worry, you're starting to get annoyed, you're starting to get frustrated. The person makes a point that you think is incorrect. Your impulse at this moment is not to check whether they might be right. Now, if a person refers to evidence, or a person makes a claim, or a person advances a perspective, that is something that can be tested. If it's a factual claim, then it's either true or it's not. So we can verify this, surely. But we don't really want to in the heart of a disagreement, do we? We've got a personal investment into a situation, and many of you will have been in that horrible scenario where you've had a long, protracted disagreement with someone and realized about 30 minutes in that they were right the entire time. The impulse at that point is not to admit that. The impulse is to double down on your argument and hold on for grim life. Now you can understand why this occurs, but looking at it from an outside perspective, it's about as irrational as it's possible to be for a person. So being aware that you may be incorrect is always a good starting point for all of this. It is also the only one of these 5 reasons that's about you. The second reason people disagree with you is just simple ignorance. Pure and simple ignorance. Put specifically, they lack the information necessary to understand your perspective. Now this is the simple provision of facts we were talking about before, right? But it can be a lot more complicated than that, because while you would think that if a person lacks information, all you need to do is introduce that information to them, show them the details. But sometimes that doesn't work, because here's the essential thing. This isn't about you, this is about them. And so when you introduce the information to them, are you introducing it to them in a way that you like, or a way that they like? Are you using language that works better for them? Are you introducing it to them in such a way that it's appealing and pleasant and enjoyable? Do you want to do any of these things? Quite possibly not, because it's very easy at this point to fall back on a little word that we really need to remove from our vocabulary to be good at this: stupid. When you say someone is stupid, generally what you're saying there is the person lacks information that you think they should already know. Now maybe they should already know it, but that doesn't change the fact that right here and now, they don't. And if the objective here is to change that person's mind, then treating them like an idiot, saying that they're stupid, or providing that information in a way that is condescending or patronizing or smug, is that going to change their mind? Would it change your mind? This is about them. If they lack information, then the very simple process for bringing them on board is to introduce the information that they don't have, figure out what that is first and foremost through questions and empathy, and then deliver it to them in such a way that appeals to that person. Now, this is not about lying. It's not about massaging the truth, it's about introducing it to them in an acceptable and pleasant way, which is very enabled through questions and empathy. Empathy, for the record, should not be misunderstood as being nice or sympathetic. It's a source of information. Understanding what the other person needs is fundamental to being able to provide it. The third reason people disagree with you is a bit more complicated. This is misinterpretation of the facts. This isn't a lack of information. We've all had that rather distressing experience of having a conversation with someone who knows what they're talking about, who is informed, who has done a wide variety of research and is able to quote facts and figures at you, but they're still wrong. How is that possible? In a world with Wikipedia and the internet, it shouldn't be hard to correct this, right? Go out and find the accurate information. Reform your opinion. But they're still wrong. Because the problem here is not a lack of information. It is rather that they process that information incorrectly. This results from two major causes. First and foremost, rhetorical biases. Manipulation of language in such a way that is cognitively or intuitively persuasive, even though it's completely invalid. A classic example of this is a straw man argument, where rather than address the other person's argument directly, you change the argument to make it easier to win. A classic example of this from the early 2000s went along the lines of person A would say, I have a problem with the war in Iraq, I don't think it's a good idea. And person B would say, why don't you support our troops? At which point person A would have a problem because that wasn't what they were talking about, but it sounds like it's associated with what they're talking about, and the goalposts have suddenly been moved, and that's a much harder point to argue. Now, never mind the fact that perhaps the best way to support troops is not to send them into war in the first place, but by moving the goalposts, person B is suddenly in control. The second means of irrationally processing the same information is cognitive bias. Now, these are a lot more insidious because they're not spoken. They're factors of your thinking. Very common in human beings, and there are 188 that are known to psychology, and we add to them all the time. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is confirmation bias. A tendency for people to seek out sources of information that confirms what they already believe, and ignoring sources of information that contradict what they already believe. No one likes having to listen to people they think are wrong. It's unpleasant, and in extreme cases can be quite physically distressing. The problem with this, of course, is that what if that site has a point? And even if they don't, if you don't know what they're talking about, how can you address it? And so as a result, you're very disempowered. Addressing this barrier is very, very challenging because it's not enough simply to turn around to the person and say you're being irrational. Trust me, I've tried that, it doesn't work. It sounds condescending, and to a degree it is. Rather, questions are your friend here once again. Talk to the person and figure out how they arrived at this conclusion. Now note that there's a very strong distinction to be had here between genuine questions and an interrogation. No one likes to be interrogated, and everyone knows what that feels like. It wouldn't work on you, it won't work on them. Genuine questions. Find out how they got themselves into this position, because bear this in mind, that if you're working off the same facts and you've reached different points, you have at some point diverged. If you can find that point, you've got a point of commonality and you can work it forward from there. The fourth reason people disagree with you is protection of self. Simply put, no one likes to be attacked. If you have something that you care very, very strongly about and someone criticizes that thing, then a cognitive bias comes into play that is overwhelming, known as the backfire effect. This is the tendency for a person to respond to criticism of something really central to their beliefs and their identity, not just by rejecting that information, but by doubling down and strengthening the existing belief. Classic examples of this: have a go at someone's kids. Criticize their children. Next time you're around at a barbecue and someone's got their kids there, say, that kid's a brat. See what happens. You know what's worse? If you're right. Because at this point, the parent has two choices: reality or loyalty to their child. Guess which one wins? Either way, it's a very bad day for that parent. The key point here is that if you attack a person's beliefs, you attack the person. And if you attack the person, you're not going to change their mind. They will immediately go on the defensive, at which point you're wasting your time. Once again, asking questions is always a good move here, but empathy is essential. What does the person care about? What are they fighting to protect? 90% of the time what you'll find at this point is it's got nothing to do with the detail of what they're discussing. In a business environment, never mind the details of the negotiation and the precise dollar figures and the precise material qualities. What does this client care about? Because if you can address that, everything else follows. And finally, the fifth reason people disagree with you, while very rare, is nonetheless real: pure malice. Sometimes people just like hurting other people. Sometimes people are willing to hurt other people for personal benefit. So maybe it's not an enjoyment of the suffering so much as a thorough willingness to cause it for an outcome. The interesting thing is this tends to come from both ends of the ideological spectrum, in the sense that it can come from extreme pragmatism. This is what is necessary to get the job done. It can also come from the extremes of ideology though. This is what has to happen. This is essential. This is the big picture, has to happen. I don't care who gets hurt in the process. Or as Stalin put it, you need to break some eggs to have a revolution. Where this comes into play, the best solution is always to sanction the behavior. This is what law is for, this is what company policy is for, this is what deontological ethics in particular are very good at dealing with, but sometimes this isn't possible. In some cases, malicious people are very effective at using those policy frameworks to their advantage. This all becomes significantly worse if that person is in a position of power, because as discussed in other videos, the more power you have by default, the less accountability there is for the use of that power. If you are faced with someone in these circumstances and you do not have the capacity to sanction that behavior and make it stop, or walk away from it in a way that doesn't cost you too much, then you need to figure out what that person wants. But unlike the other forms of resolution we've talked about here, this is less about working with them towards a constructive solution that benefits everyone, and it's more about making them stop. What does the person actually want? Figure that out and you've got the means of changing their behavior. This may sound like manipulation, and that's because it is. But if you are faced with someone that poses an imminent threat, physical or otherwise, to you or other people around you, then you do what is necessary in order to get the better resolution. So if you're facing a person that is willing to do this, is willing to cause harm to others, knowingly cause harm to others in order to advance their personal interests, one of the key things you need to bear in mind here is a second word that you need to expunge from your vocabulary, specifically the concept of evil. Just as stupid is used to simplify a situation and make you not have to care about the needs of that person, evil is used as a way of not having to deal with the other person. When you use that word specifically, what you really mean by that is that the person is beyond your help, that you can't deal with that person, that they're nearly otherworldly in their corruption. Now for starters, that's very rarely true, but even if it is true, when you say they're evil, you're disempowering yourself. You're saying that I don't have any options. They're beyond anything I can do. And this is very rarely the case. As other videos have hopefully illustrated by this point, one of the beautiful things about ethics, and particularly moral creativity, you have so many options for dealing with any given situation. It's only through your own thinking that you can take these off the table. And when you use the word evil, as well as the word stupid, you're taking options off the table. You are only disempowering yourself. What all of these 5 reasons illustrate is that conflict is very rarely about the detail. 90% of the time, it's about the fundamental motivations at play. If you can understand what the person cares about, what is central to their character, what they fundamentally want to achieve, then you have a vastly better chance of achieving an outcome that you want and that they also want, rather than quibbling about the detail.